In Cape Town, 26-year-old Ayanda Kumalo stood quietly in her grandfather's grand office, trying to steady her breathing. The room felt heavy, filled with family members, senior executives, and people who had watched her grow up. Today was supposed to be important. After years of working silently behind the scenes, she believed this was finally her moment. Her grandfather, Baba Mthembu Kumalo, sat behind his massive desk, flipping through documents like it was just another normal day. To everyone else he looked calm and powerful. But to Ayanda, his silence felt like a storm waiting to break. She had spent years helping the company, late nights, smart ideas, solving problems no one else could fix. She never asked for praise. She just thought her hard work would speak for itself. Then suddenly he stopped reading, looked straight at her and said coldly, "You are useless. You don't deserve this company." For a second everything went silent. Ayanda felt like the ground disappeared beneath her feet. Before she could even react, he signed the papers and announced that the majority of the company shares were being transferred, not to her but to her stepsister, Lerato. Whispers spread across the room. Some people looked shocked, others just avoided eye contact. Lerato stepped forward with a proud smile, clearly enjoying every second of it. Ayanda didn't say anything. She just stood there, holding back her emotions as her heart broke in silence. But deep inside, behind that quiet face, something changed. Something strong. Something dangerous. Ayanda had always been the one people overlooked. Growing up in Durban, she was never the loud or attention-seeking type. While other kids tried to stand out, she stayed in the background, watching, learning, and understanding things deeply. She didn't care about showing off, she cared about getting things right. In the same house, her stepsister Lerato was the complete opposite. Lerato was confident, stylish, and always knew how to impress people. She spoke loudly, laughed freely, and made sure everyone noticed her. Family members loved that about her. They praised her in front of everyone, calling her future leader and born for success. Meanwhile, Ayanda would just sit quietly listening. But what no one realized was that Ayanda was always thinking. While others were talking, she was observing how people made decisions, how money moved, how businesses grew or failed. Even as a teenager, she would spend hours reading about business strategies, market trends, and leadership. She wasn't just learning, she was preparing. As she got older, she slowly started helping with her grandfather's company. At first it was small things, reviewing reports, suggesting minor changes. But those small suggestions started making big differences. Profits improved, problems were solved faster. New ideas worked. The strange part? No one knew it was her. Her grandfather would present those ideas in meetings like they were his own, or sometimes give credit to senior managers. Lerato would still get praise just for showing up and speaking confidently, even when she didn't understand the details. And Ayanda? She stayed silent, not because she was weak, but because she believed her time would come. She believed that one day all her hard work, all those late nights, all those smart decisions would finally be seen. But year after year nothing changed. She was still invisible, still underestimated, still treated like she didn't matter. And slowly, without anyone noticing, that quiet, patient girl was turning into someone much stronger than they could ever imagine. News of what happened in that office didn't stay there for long. Within hours, the story had spread through the entire family, and by the next day, it had reached business circles and corporate networks across the city. People were talking, whispering, and making their own versions of the story. But the worst part? No one knew the truth. To them, Ayanda wasn't the hardworking granddaughter anymore. She became the one who wasn't good enough, the one who got rejected, the one her own grandfather called useless. Everywhere she went she could feel it, the looks, the whispers, the silent judgment. At family gatherings, conversations would suddenly stop when she walked into the room. Some relatives looked at her with pity, others with quiet disappointment. No one asked her side of the story. No one even tried to understand. And at the company, it hurt even more. Employees who once respected her started acting differently. Some avoided her completely, like she didn't exist anymore. Others spoke to her in a cold, distant way. A few even treated her like she was beneath them, like she had no place there anymore. The same people who once followed her ideas without knowing it, now looked at her like she had failed. And Lerato? She was everywhere, walking through the office with confidence, giving orders, smiling like she had truly earned it all. People surrounded her, praising her, trying to stay on her good side. It was like Ayanda had been erased overnight. Anyone else would have reacted, argued, defended themselves, maybe even broken down in front of everyone. But not Ayanda. She didn't say a word. She didn't try to explain. She didn't fight back. Instead she stayed quiet and watched. She watched the way decisions were being made. She noticed the small mistakes no one else could see. She paid attention to how quickly things were starting to shift under Lorato's leadership. While everyone thought her silence meant weakness, it was actually something else. She was learning. She was waiting. And deep inside she was preparing for something no one saw coming. What no one knew was the real story behind the company's success. While everyone was busy praising Bobam Thembu and now celebrating Lorato, the truth was quietly hidden in the background, and that truth was Ayanda. For years, Ayanda had been deeply involved in the company's biggest and most profitable projects. The ideas that brought in millions, many of them started with her. The smart cost-cutting strategies that saved the business during tough times, that was her thinking. Even some of the biggest partnerships the company had signed, those connections came through her effort and planning. But she never put her name on anything. She would sit late at night reviewing reports, finding problems and coming up with solutions. Then she would pass those ideas quietly to her grandfather or through internal notes. And every time those ideas worked, and they always did, someone else took the credit. She told herself it didn't matter. She believed loyalty and patience would eventually pay off. But that wasn't all. Ayanda had also built something much deeper: relationships. Real ones. She had personally spoken to key clients, investors and partners behind the scenes. They trusted her judgment, her calm way of thinking and her honesty. Some of them didn't even realize how important she was to the company, but they trusted her more than anyone else. And then there were the agreements, small, quiet but powerful. Some partnerships were based on her personal involvement. Some ideas and strategies were hers alone, never officially signed over, never legally transferred. She had kept copies, records, and proof of her contributions, not because she planned revenge, but because she believed in protecting her work. So while the world thought Ayanda had nothing, the truth was the opposite. She had knowledge. She had connections. She had ideas that were still hers. And most importantly, she had built a foundation that the company was still standing on. They took her shares. They took her title. But what they didn't realize was, they never really had her power in the first place. The moment Lorato took control, things started to shift, and not in a good way. At first no one really noticed. She walked into meetings with confidence, made big announcements and smiled as if she had everything under control. Everyone assumed she would continue the legacy her grandfather had built. But slowly cracks began to show. Lorato's decisions were guided more by her ego than by knowledge or experience. She rushed into projects without understanding the details. She ignored advice from experienced managers, thinking she knew better. At first, small mistakes went unnoticed, but soon the consequences started piling up. Clients who had trusted the company for years began to feel ignored. Requests went unanswered, deals were delayed, and some even started looking for alternatives. Meetings that used to run smoothly turned into arguments. Important contracts were mishandled and deadlines were missed. The confidence that once surrounded the company began to fade. Financial reports started showing instability. Profits weren't just slowing, they were dipping. Expenses were rising because of careless decisions, and investments that should have been secure were suddenly at risk. Employees who had worked hard for years were frustrated, confused, and anxious. Some of the loyal managers even considered leaving, realizing the person in charge didn't understand the work they had built together. The empire that had once thrived under careful strategy and silent planning, the one Ayanda had helped build, was beginning to crumble. And the irony? No one noticed how fragile things had become because Lorato presented everything with confidence. People believed in appearances rather than results. Behind the scenes, Ayanda watched from afar. She had left Cape Town, but she still had connections in the company. She could see the slow unraveling, and with every mistake Lorato made, her resolve grew stronger. The useless granddaughter they had dismissed wasn't gone. She was quietly learning how to turn this collapse into an opportunity. The fall had begun, and Lorato didn't even realize she was standing at the edge of a cliff she couldn't see. The company's foundation had been shaken, and Ayanda was about to show just how strong that foundation really was. After the humiliation in Cape Town, Ayanda knew she couldn't stay where she wasn't valued. She quietly packed her things and moved to Johannesburg, determined to start fresh. This time she wouldn't wait for anyone to notice her. She would build something of her own, on her terms. She didn't need her grandfather's approval or the company's official recognition. Over the years she had quietly built relationships, learn the ins and outs of business, and earn the trust of clients, investors, and partners. Now she was ready to put all of that to use. Ayanda started by reaching out to people who already knew her skills. Some were former clients who had worked with her behind the scenes. Some were business partners who had quietly relied on her strategies. Everyone she contacted remembered how capable she was, and many were eager to support her, finally directly working with her, not through her family name. Her first steps were careful but strategic. She rented a small office in the heart of Johannesburg, enough to start operations without drawing unnecessary attention. Then she began assembling a team. She didn't need a flashy recruitment campaign. She attracted smart, driven people who wanted to work with someone who actually knew what she was doing. While Lerato was making careless decisions in Cape Town, Ayanda focused on building a solid foundation. She mapped out her business plan, prioritized key clients, and even revisited some of the strategies she had developed in her grandfather's company. Only this time, everything was fully under her control and every success would be hers. Months passed and her venture slowly took shape. Deals that had been impossible to close before now came to her effortlessly because people trusted her judgment. She was no longer the granddaughter who failed. She was Ayanda Kumalo, the one who knew her worth, the one whose ideas actually worked. And through it all she remained calm and collected. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to boast. Every step was silent, deliberate, and powerful. The move to Johannesburg wasn't just a physical relocation. It was the first step in a plan that would change everything for her, and for everyone who had underestimated her. While the world thought she was out of the picture, Ayanda was quietly creating something bigger, something unstoppable. Ayanda's new company started quietly, but it didn't take long for people to notice. Every decision she made was smart, every strategy carefully planned. Clients who had once doubted her now saw the results, and they were impressed. Within weeks, word spread that this wasn't just a small startup. It was a serious competitor. She focused on what mattered most: quality, trust, and results. She treated her clients with respect and honesty, something that had been missing under Lerato's leadership at her grandfather's company. People began to trust her not because of her family name, but because she delivered what she promised, every single time. Investors who had been hesitant at first quickly came on board. They saw her track record, her clear plans, and her ability to execute under pressure. Big contracts started rolling in, some from clients who had previously worked with her grandfather's company. And suddenly Ayanda wasn't just a player, she was a serious contender. Within months, her company began competing directly with her grandfather's empire. Projects that had once been untouchable now had Ayanda's signature on them. Competitors underestimated her at first, thinking she was inexperienced. But they were wrong. Every move she made was calculated, precise, and effective. Back in Cape Town, the family began to notice. Whispers started about how the useless granddaughter had suddenly built a thriving business from nothing. Employees who had laughed at her before started paying attention. Some even reached out privately, curious to know how she had done it. And Lerato? She was starting to feel pressure she hadn't anticipated. The confident smiles in boardrooms began to fade. Deals she thought were secure started slipping away. Clients were now comparing her company with Ayanda's, and the difference was clear. Ayanda, however, remained calm. She didn't rush to prove anything. She didn't need to announce her success to the world. She let her results speak for themselves. Every contract won, every investor impressed, every client satisfied was another silent message to the family and the world. They had underestimated her, and it was their mistake. The rise of Ayanda Kumalo wasn't just unexpected, it was unstoppable. And the very empire that had once dismissed her was about to feel the full impact of what they had ignored for so long. As Ayanda's new company grew stronger, the truth that had been hidden for years began to surface. Former employees, partners, and clients, people who had worked closely with her in her grandfather's company, started speaking up. They remembered her ideas, her strategies, and the way she had quietly solved problems that no one else could handle. Slowly, the story everyone believed about the useless granddaughter began to crumble. People started realizing that many of the original company's biggest successes had been Ayanda's work all along. The strategies that had doubled profits, the partnerships that had brought in millions, the innovations that had kept the company ahead of competitors. Those were all hers. It wasn't her grandfather's brilliance. It wasn't Lerato's charm. It had been Ayanda working quietly behind the scenes, building the foundation that everyone else had taken credit for. The news spread quickly. In business circles, Colleagues began to openly acknowledge her contributions. Investors who had once trusted the company because of the family name now realized they had been relying on Ayanda's skill all along. Former employees began sharing stories, pointing out how she had guided major decisions without anyone ever noticing. Even within the family, the narrative started to shift. Conversations that had mocked her now focused on admiration. People who had laughed at her, dismissed her, or ignored her efforts could no longer deny the facts. Ayanda wasn't just competent, she was the mastermind. She had quietly carried the empire on her shoulders, and finally the world was seeing it. Lorato, on the other hand, couldn't hide the cracks any longer. The mistakes she had made as the company's leader were becoming more obvious, and now they were being measured against Ayanda's undeniable success. The contrast was stark, and it left many in shock. For Ayanda, this wasn't about revenge. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. But the recognition finally coming her way was sweet. Years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed were being reversed. The useless granddaughter label that had haunted her for so long was gone. In its place stood Ayanda Kumalo, the woman who had built an empire quietly, patiently, and brilliantly. And now, everyone who had ever doubted her could finally see what she had truly been capable of all along. Bobam Thembu Kumalo finally had to face the truth. For years he had dismissed Ayanda as useless, praising Lorato instead and handing her the company he had built. But now, as he watched from his Cape Town office, it became painfully clear that the granddaughter he had underestimated was the real force behind his empire. Every report, every client meeting, every investor call he heard about Ayanda's growing company was a reminder of what he had ignored. Her success wasn't small, it was enormous. Within months, her business was attracting contracts, partnerships, and recognition that his own company was struggling to maintain under Lorato's control. Employees he had once trusted were now quietly comparing Lorato's poor decisions with Ayanda's brilliance. Lorato, confident at first, was now facing the consequences of her ego-driven leadership. Deals were falling through, key clients were leaving, and the financial stability that had been carefully maintained for years was starting to wobble. Her mistakes were becoming obvious, and the family and business circles alike could see it. Bobam Thembu felt a deep sting, not just as a businessman but as a grandfather. He had thought he knew who was capable, who deserved success, and who would carry his legacy forward. But all his judgment had been wrong. The granddaughter he had called useless had been the backbone of the company all along. Every triumph, every innovation he had celebrated had been built on her ideas and efforts. It wasn't just the business that showed him his error. Friends, colleagues, and even family members were now acknowledging Ayanda's talent and leadership. Whispered conversations about Lorato's failures contrasted sharply with stories of Ayanda's achievements. For the first time, Bobam Thembu experienced what it felt like to be on the other side. Watching someone he had misjudged rise far above his expectations, he realized that authority and power didn't always equal wisdom. He had let ego and appearances cloud his judgment, and it had cost him dearly, not just in business, but in losing sight of who truly deserved recognition. For Ayanda, of course, none of this was about seeking revenge. But for Bobam Thembu, the lesson was undeniable. The granddaughter he had rejected had proven herself in ways he could no longer ignore. His misjudgment was clear, his family's trust shaken, and his empire's strength tested. For the first time, the powerful patriarch faced the consequences of his mistake, and there was no one to blame but himself. Standing in her sleek office in the heart of Johannesburg, Ayanda looked out over the city skyline, the sun glinting off the glass buildings like sparks of her own journey. She took a deep breath and let herself smile, remembering how far she had come. The granddaughter who was once dismissed, called useless by her own grandfather, had not only survived the humiliation, she had thrived. She thought back to that day in Cape Town when her shares were handed to Lorato. At the time it had felt like the end of everything. But now she realized it had been the beginning of something far greater. Losing what she thought was hers had forced her to create her own path, to build a business from the ground up using nothing but her skill, her vision, and the relationships she had quietly nurtured over the years. Her company was no longer small. It was thriving, attracting clients and investors who respected her intelligence and honesty. Every deal, every success, every contract was a reminder that she didn't need anyone's approval to prove her worth. Not even her grandfather's. And it wasn't just about business. It was about her strength, her patience, and her resilience. She had taken every insult, every doubt, every whisper of failure and turned it into fuel. She had risen quietly, deliberately, and now she stood taller than anyone had expected. Ayanda smiled again, a spark of satisfaction lighting her eyes. The girl who had been called useless had done more than prove them wrong. She had built her own empire, stronger than she had ever imagined. She had taken control of her destiny, and nothing, not doubt, not betrayal, not family politics, could stop her now. She was no longer just capable. She was unstoppable.